now got the letter written to the Philippians. These are some verses from Philippians 1. I would you should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all other places. And many of the brethren in the Lord, waxing confident by my bonds, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Skipping a few verses. I know that this shall turn to my salvation through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and my hope, that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labour. Yet what I shall choose, I wot not. For I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. And having this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you all for the furtherance and joy of faith. I think you're all familiar with what's called Paul's 4 prison epistles. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and then the short epistle to Philemon. Those 4 prison epistles of Paul were written at the end of Acts 28, when Paul was 2 years under house arrest in Rome. And there, so that's at the end of his 3rd missionary journey, and after the journey to Rome, and after being imprisoned in Jerusalem and then 2 years in Caesarea, there Paul writes to the church that he'd founded in the middle of the 2nd missionary journey. So several years have passed when he writes the 4 chapters to the Philippians. And let's think about the congregation in Philippi. Dave Portinga asked me, which is why I asked Maria, what size would the church have been in Philippi when Paul was there in the 2nd missionary journey, and maybe it grew a bit for the 3rd missionary journey? Well, Maria reckons that around the middle of the 1st century, Philippi would have had a population of less than 10,000. So that gives you some indication. Then we know of some people, so whatever percentage of that we can't say, but we know of some people who were in the church. Think of names. Lydia and her household. But, what's the but? She's from Thyatira, and she's a travelling saleswoman and businesswoman, so she may well have moved on. It's hard to say. Then there's the slave girl, and let's make this not a tragedy but a comedy. She's now become a believer. She's got her life back in order. She meets a really fine guy, and the two of them settle down and have 15 children.
That's a comedy.
It's a comedy. And then there's the jailer and his family. So they've stayed in the church and they've been baptized and they're growing up under the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The epistle to the Philippians tells of 2 women in the church at Philippi. Anyone remember the names of the 2 women? Euodias and
Syntyche.
Philippians 4 and verse 2. I beseech Euodias and I beseech Syntyche that they be of the same mind in the Lord. So this was something really, really strange. It doesn't happen in the 21st century. But if you would believe it, in the 1st century in the church, there were a couple of women who fell out. Anyone think that's credible?
Disagreed.
People don't know whether to laugh or not, especially the ladies. Okay, so no, not a comedy. It could be a tragedy. So we have those 2 ladies, and then we have, in the very first reference, very first verse of the book, we have a reference to the bishops or elders and deacons. So the church is established, it's got elders and deacons, and there are 2 sorts of elders. 1 Timothy 5 verse 17 says teaching elders and ruling elders, and that's explained in our form for the ordination of elders. So it's got bishops, a plurality of elders, a plurality of deacons, It is these two ladies, and it has families with children. And there's another person who's mentioned in the book, Epaphroditus. And I think Epaphroditus, there was a picture of him in the church building back there, yes. So that's the church. What size it was, we're not too clear. Now, with regard to the epistle to the Philippians, it's one of the harder books to summarize. So I thought that I would give you some more personal perspectives on the book of Philippians, hoping that that would be interesting and, I trust, edifying. Paul's in prison, as I say, and he explains to the church in Philippi, the things which have happened unto me have fallen out rather onto the furtherance of the gospel. So he's in the Roman prison, and people are thinking, isn't this terrible? Our best, most fruitful, hard-working apostle and greatest theologian is in jail. What a disaster. And Paul explains that what looked to be a disaster was actually a good thing, because, as he goes on to say, it has emboldened other people to preach the gospel. And I remember that fondly, and my wife does too, because this was the theme of family visitation earlier in my ministry when our church went through a very difficult time. We disbanded, and we only had maybe 15 people at a worship service. So we did family visitation, we went around all the families, and we explained to them, because this was our belief, and we were convinced of this, that the things that happened to us happened for our advantage. They were good things, that this actually needed to happen because some people no longer believed the doctrines of the church and they had caused problems, and now they left us. Now we've got a sound foundation. Now we can rebuild, and that the Lord is with us. And that went through family visitation. Not everybody in the church agreed with everything that was said, but we said this is the position of the steering committee, and here's why we think it. We'd like you to consider this. And then, secondly, we had some sermons on Philippians 3. Anyone remember Philippians 3? The theme text for that chapter was, I press towards the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. So the theme of the series of sermons on those 21 verses was pressing towards the mark. And it talks about justification by faith alone. True spiritual circumcision. Paul's being apprehended by God, and then Paul's apprehending Christ by faith, and then learning to know God through sufferings and the experience of God's sanctifying work inside him. And then we had another series later, which really fits in well with Paul's situation in jail, both in Philippi, here, that way, and in Rome, whatever direction Rome is from here. Philippians 4 contains texts about peace and contentment and joy. And here was Paul. He had peace in that little cell, if that was the specific place. And he had peace in prison through his union with Jesus Christ. He had contentment in those places. And he was the one who said, I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content, which is an amazing thing, because we can be content in various circumstances, but not others. And sometimes we think we could be content in certain circumstances, but we couldn't. But he learned to be content by the grace of God in whatever state he was. He ended up in a lot worse states than we have been. Peace, contentment, and joy even. One last thing. I mentioned at the start the 4 prison epistles. Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. And there's reason to believe that of those 4, Philippians was the last, or at least nearly the last, because Paul talks about the possibility of death in chapter 1, part of the verses we read. He said, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain. If I die, that's better for me, because then I go to be with Christ. If I live, that means I can help you, Philippians, and others, I trust. And then he worked out that it would be better, weighing all things up, for him to live a little bit longer. And then he concluded that, given this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you all for the furtherance of joy and faith. So he concluded, that he was going to be released. And then he said, I'm sending Epaphroditus back to you. He brought from the Philippians some financial support, food, clothing, whatever it was. I'm sending him back to you. He'll be carrying this letter. And then Timothy will come shortly afterwards. And then when I get released, I plan to come back to you.